Hello, and welcome back to another episode. It is that time of year once more. My favourite time of the year. Halloween is upon us, and I am very much in the mood. I am just bubbling with excitement, and of course, that means I want to share with you some ghost stories. This year, I'm returning to my favourite collection of ghost stories, a little book that I used to carry around with me as a teenager all the time, called Haunted Clwyd by Richard Holland. These stories are the stories of the towns, hills, mountains, forests, and moorlands of my youth. These are the lore that surrounded me, and I used to take great satisfaction in visiting places and knowing where the haunted houses were. And even today, when I go back to Wales, it's such a pleasure to bask in this rich tapestry of stories. And so naturally, I want to share these stories with you. So, our first story of the evening comes from a place called Clwyd. To move into a haunted house may be thought unlucky, but to move from one into another equally haunted house is surely very bad luck indeed. Such a misfortune befell the Butler family in 1886, when Mr. Butler was appointed engineer to the Vron Iron Works. Their story is recorded by the Reverend Lee of Hanmer Church in his Preacher's Book. Mrs. Butler, says Reverend Lee, was left for a week to stay alone in Old Cymai Hall at the Llwyd near Cymai. On the first night, she was awoken by a tapping on her window. A hollow voice called up to her from the darkness outside. "Pray for my soul." Mrs. Butler hid under the covers, terrified, but the tapping continued and the voice repeatedly intoned its request. "Pray for my soul." It went on all night, and Mrs. Butler eventually fell into a fitful sleep. But she decided to say nothing of her experience the next morning. On the second night, the insistent tapping came once more. And again the voice moaned, "Pray for my soul." Mrs. Butler tried to ignore the plea, but it was impossible. At last she managed a prayer that the injured soul, whosoever it might be, should find rest. The tapping ceased and the voice was silent. In the morning, Mrs. Butler told the housekeeper of the unearthly voice and learned that a man had killed himself quite recently outside the house at a spot below her window. A week later, the Butlers moved on, with some gratitude I expect from Mrs. Butler, to New Cymai Hall, now known as Cymai Farm, on the slope of Mount Hope. But every night, in their room above the drawing room, they found no rest. Mr. Butler was awoken by the feeling of someone putting a hand on his chest. Once, when Mrs. Butler was alone, there was simultaneously a knocking at her door and at her mother's door. They both called out, "Who is it?" and received no reply. They went to investigate, meeting each other bemused in the passageway. According to the Reverend Lee, many people used the room in later years and suffered in just the way the Butlers had. Our second story of the evening is entitled Mynydd Isa. The first indication Jeff Ellis had that his new home was haunted was when he heard his dog trotting upstairs. "Misty," he yelled, "get back down here at once." "I don't know what you're shouting for," replied his wife, Viv. "Misty's sitting at your feet." And so he was, looking up at Jeff, surprised, and with a bit of a hurt expression. Since then, the ghost dog of Primrose Cottage and its phantom companions have become so much a part of Jeff's family that he has become almost blasé about them. When Jeff bought Primrose Cottage, it was a shell. 3 old cottages knocked into one, and requiring a great deal of renovation. But Jeff fell in love with it immediately. It had such a good atmosphere, it was so welcoming, Jeff told me, that I knew we'd be happy here, and happy we have been. He continued, "There's nothing threatening about the ghosts. In fact, I'm sure my little girl, plays with the dog. She'll chuckle away for hours in an empty room, having fun with someone. I don't often see it myself. Usually, I just hear it pattering upstairs, but occasionally I get a glimpse of it walking through the living room. It's an indistinct shape, and usually has someone with it, either a little old woman or man. It's difficult to be certain because the image is so shadowy, like a glimpse out of the corner of your eye. Look again, and they'll be gone." A tall male figure wearing a grey sweater is also sometimes seen passing by a door into the kitchen from the hall. This may be the man seen accompanying the dog, or another apparition altogether. Either way, he bears similarities with the others, in that he is shadowy, featureless, harmless, silent, and anonymous. Presumably, all 3 or 4 ghosts are those of former occupants of the cottage, but from which period it is unknown. Jeff does not seem too curious about his mysterious tenants. He is happy to leave them in peace, if they do him the same courtesy. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. The ghosts enjoy playing the occasional prank on Jeff and his family. "Things disappear," Jeff explained grimly. "You put things down, then go to get them, and they've gone. It happened recently with my wife's purse. Viv put it down by the telephone, and a minute later it had gone. Of course she was frantic. It contained all her money, car keys, the lot. She roped everyone into the search, and the house was turned upside down. And then, after a day of searching, suddenly there it was, back just where she'd left it, by the phone. It's infuriating. Actually," he added, "I had a very peculiar experience once when I was using the phone. I was alone in the house in the middle of a conversation when I suddenly felt a hand pinch my bum. Made me jump, I can tell you. You wouldn't think a ghost would do that, would you? But I suppose they have to get their fun somehow." However extraordinary that experience may have been, this is not the end of Primrose Cottage's mysteries. Most enigmatic of all is the inexplicable whistling, which can sometimes be heard from the bathroom. Jeff is convinced that it has an intelligence behind it, for it seems to warn of impending accidents. The family have learned to take notice of it. Gary Tolley, Jeff's brother-in-law, was one of the first to hear it. He said, "While we were doing up the house, I was drilling through a wall in the kitchen, and then suddenly I heard this strange whistling coming from the bathroom upstairs. The house was a shell, so I could hear it echoing downstairs quite easily. A moment later I drilled through a wire and got an electric shock." On another occasion, David, Jeff's eldest son, was wiring into a wall when we heard the whistling again, and seconds later he shorted the house with his screwdriver. I'm sure the sound is meant as a warning. We don't hear it so often now, but we did quite a few times while we were doing the building work. Once we had been working through the night and I'd gone outside for a smoke when Jeff and the others heard the whistling again. By this time they'd learned to take notice of it, so they scurried around trying to find out what was up. They came looking for me, and there I was, so tired that I'd fallen asleep standing up, my cigarette burning down to my fingers. There seems no explanation for the warning whistle, but one thing all are agreed on: it doesn't sound human. "It's more like a bird call," said Gary. "A warbling noise, like someone is trying to do an impression of a bird. It's very peculiar, unearthly, but it's proven useful." The common conception of what a haunted house should be is done away with completely when one enters Primrose Cottage. A bright and happy home, it is anything but eerie. One can hardly blame a few departed souls for wishing to linger on here, in such a warm and welcoming atmosphere. Our final story of the evening concerns a place called Ruthin. Behind the 19th century Ruthin Castle, now a luxurious hotel famous for its medieval banquets, are the evocative ruins of the original castle, another of Edward I's Welsh chain of fortresses, including Rhuddlan, Flint, Conway, Carnarvon, Harlech and Beaumaris castles. Its red sandstone walls reflect a bloody past. The castle was under the command of Reginald de Grey, whose arrogance towards the Welsh was largely responsible for the Owain Glyndwr uprising. A hint of de Grey's cruelty can be taken from the Drowning Pit, a small dungeon which would become flooded by the moat when the gate was raised. Here prisoners were put for de Grey's entertainment. The captive suffered an agonizing death, struggling to keep his head above water until he eventually drowned. The Whipping Pit, at the base of another of the towers, needs little explanation. In the light of such remnants of medieval horror, it seems surprising that the castle is today haunted by none but the peaceful presence of the Grey Lady, whose alleged grave can be found in a secluded corner of the battlements. She is believed to have been the wife of de Grey's second in command. She discovered her husband was having an affair with another woman, so promptly dispatched her rival with an axe. When the dreadful deed was discovered, she was sentenced to death. Because she was a murderess, her body was buried in the battlements rather than in consecrated ground, causing her restless spirit to wander for eternity. Dressed in a long grey gown, she is often encountered on the ramparts, or most commonly in the medieval chapel, now the banqueting hall. Guests at the hotel can relax safe in the knowledge that her presence is an unthreatening one, and that she has never been seen with her axe. Well, not yet at least. Now actually, I had my 18th birthday party in Ruthin Castle. Me and some friends hired the place out for a meal, and we played pool late until the night, and we didn't see a grey lady. So, An eerie and enigmatic apparition was seen by student Amanda Cooper in the summer of 1990 from a flat overlooking Wells Street in the centre of Ruthin. She had been having a cup of coffee with a friend late one night, when she chanced a look out of the window and at once noticed a strange figure limping very badly, dragging its right leg, walking up Wells Street towards the square. Amanda continued. It slowly made its way up the narrow pavement and came to the gap in the wall where the entrance to Manor House is. It stopped here, turned and faced upwards, looking up towards the flat window. It was small, maybe 5 foot, and was wearing a light grey drab cloak down to the ground, and had a big baggy hood covering its head. Where its face should have been was black. It carried on staring up for about 30 seconds. Amanda had recognised there was something unearthly about the figure at once, and to her friends, whom she had quickly called over, she said only half in jest, "I hope we're not seeing the Grim Reaper, because we're both in for it, if so." However, any fears of this sort were proved unfounded, as the apparition slowly turned away and walked down the path to the manor house's main entrance, where it vanished. The girls were greatly frightened, and they can both recall the sighting vividly. However, to my knowledge, this is an isolated incident, and the mysterious figure has certainly never been seen by either of the two girls again. I love it. I love a good ghost story, and more to the point, I love that I was surrounded by so many good ghost stories as a child. Hopefully you have enjoyed these ghost stories as much as I have enjoyed telling them. As ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.